How does a dad react when a punk, juvenile jerk of a son who wished him dead comes home? That's the story I want to look at today. The response of a dad to a rebellious son coming home. You are acquainted, you are familiar with the story of the prodigal son from Luke 15. You've read it or heard it or seen it illustrated. One of the things that is highlighted for us throughout, there's three characters. There's the older son, there's the young son who runs off and comes home, and then there is the father. The father being, in a lot of ways, the key throughout the story. Not entirely, there's more to the story than that, but the father is on display here today. I looked at the prodigal son the last time. This time I want to look at the dad. The father had two sons. Verse 11 tells us that in this parable. The crazy thing about the story, in a lot of ways, at least to me, is that not only does he have two sons, that's not crazy, it's the fact that both of the sons resent him and hate him. One says it outright in that he asks for his inheritance, he asks for his money, and then he wants to go live however he wants away from the father. He just said it out loud, essentially. He didn't say those words, "I hate you, I want you dead," because I probably wouldn't have got him his money, but to even come forward and ask for his inheritance is equivalent to that. The dad gives him his request, gives him his money, and the boy goes out and he spends it all on loose living, as it tells us in verse 13. The dad's response to him coming home is in some ways, especially in the first century, in an honor-based society like they lived in, would have been unexpected. In some ways, it was improper. Many a Pharisee type might have heard the story that Jesus relays and would feel at least some heartfelt, sympathy for the dad as he runs and embraces his son. But they would have also felt like he was being weak, most likely. They would have felt like he was not following the protocol. He was not upholding the honor-based system as they would expect. Verse 20 tells us that not only did he feel compassion for his son as he's looking for him, spots him a long way off, which means he's anticipating his return. He feels compassion, and that compassion compels him to then run, embrace, and kiss his son. And then restore him. Just the running alone was considered improper for a gentleman of the era to go running along like that. He just doesn't come across as a strong father. He comes across as weak, capitulating. The son comes and asks for money, he gives it to him. The son comes home and he runs and embraces him. He sacrifices his own dignity to embrace and restore his son. The older son responds to all this with hostility. He can't stand that his dad reacted as he did. He doesn't get it. Why do this punk comes home and now you're happy, but you never let me celebrate? So what you find is that you have a father who has two sons and neither one of them is really with him. The good news is the prodigal son turned from his sin, recognized the integrity of his dad, and came home and now has a renewed relationship with him. The older son has an entirely different problem. But the father, in my understanding, is no less willing to embrace that older son and to bring him home. He's no less willing to allow him to celebrate properly with the right kinds of things. But we find that older son doesn't really want anything to do with his dad. You come down to verse 29, and after the father, in verse 28, came out of the party and pleaded with his son to come in and enjoy the celebration. In verse 29, he answers his dad. He says, "Look, for so many years I've been serving you, and I have never neglected a command of yours. Yet you have never given me a young goat so that I might celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours came, who devoured your wealth with prostitutes, you killed the fattened calf for him." There's some serious indignation towards the dad here. what's interesting to me is that the father doesn't respond with a backhand. He doesn't respond with, what's wrong with you? Get back in line. Who are you to tell me? He doesn't do any of that. He responds with really truth. And I think the father here in this story is bewildered that the older brother isn't at all thrilled that the younger brother has come home. He says in verse 31, the dad says, "Son, you have always been with me, and all that is mine is yours. But we had to celebrate and rejoice, for this brother of yours was dead and has begun to live, and was lost and has been found." The dad tries to reason with the older son to say, it is right and proper for us to rejoice and celebrate that your brother came home. He very kindly rebukes that older son for having the wrong attitude, the wrong viewpoint of these sinners coming home, which is exactly what's going on in these three parables. You go back to verse 1 and 2 there, where it's the stage is being set with the Pharisees looking at Jesus. How can he possibly receive these sinners and these tax collectors and people? How can he do that? Their attitude is just like this older son. But I don't want to focus on that right now. I want to focus on the father. The father is eager. He is excited that this younger son came home. He wants to celebrate and rejoice with reconciliation. That's the story. That's the human story. Humans, by our nature, we are rebels. We are, whatever we can rebel against, whatever thing is propped up against us that says you shouldn't do this, what does humanity do? We rebel against it. One generation after another. Whatever the parents prop up as this is the moral thing you shouldn't do, then the young generation rebels against that thing. We as humans have rebelled since the beginning. And have rebelled and the consequence of that rebellion is that our hearts now, as Jeremiah tells us, are desperately sick, wicked, and who can know it? We have a bent, a disposition towards rebellion, towards wanting to not do what we're told by God. This story is so incredibly relatable and so human. We can see ourselves if we're thoughtful. I can see myself in the younger son a lot. I can also see myself in the older son at times. All of us fall in somewhat different categories with that. We can see, though, this same kind of judgmental attitude. And we hopefully can see the heart of the Father and his willingness to reconcile sinners. As I said, that's the human story. We rebel against him, and yet God, in his kindness, while we were still sinners, was willing to reconcile us to himself. He initiates. He sets the plan in motion. He extends the offer. He extends it through various methods. He extends it by even sending his son, who's on earth at this time, 2,000 years ago, to try to show them what the Father looks like. But they don't want it. What a tragedy. What an utter tragedy. I see the breaking heart of a father when I read this. I remember years ago watching a documentary about Amish families. And the documentary was about the year where they get to go sow their wild oats, where the young men in particular run off. They leave the compound, that's a bad word to use, but they leave the family and they leave the community of the Amish community, and they go out and they pursue the world for a year. And they followed several of these young men around, and there's actually a whole community of them, so on and so forth. And they were talking to one boy towards the end. He had been out for a couple of years. He'd been out of the Amish community. And they asked him about his family, and if they asked him, do you think your parents still miss you and all that? And he talked about it, and he had a tear in his eye a bit, and he was a little sad. He talked about how he missed his dad, and he missed his sisters and brothers, and missed home and his mom and all that stuff. But he wasn't willing to actually go home. But then the scene shifts, and now you've got the camera crew at the very end of their documentary, and it's cruising along a bumpy dirt road, and they go by a house, an Amish home, in that community, and out by the road, there's a shadowy figure. It's dark out, there's not much light or anything, and so there's a shadowy character out there by the road. And as the film crew is driving by, you see that guy turn. He turns away from the road and starts walking back to the house. And we're informed by the narrator that is actually the father of that young man that interviewed earlier. The dad, apparently, for years, this is a dad with like 10 kids or 9 kids. He had for years been going out to the road, hoping to see his son come home. I have 4 kids. 2 of them are sons. That hits a little different when you've got kids. You saw this dad, brokenhearted, just hoping to catch a glimpse of his son, to see him come home. What an incredible thing that would be if we could catch on camera that the time that young man actually comes home. His dad's been waiting for years to see him. He's got 9 others at home, but he just can't wait for that one to return. That's the heart of a father. And that, more than that, that's the heart of our Heavenly Father, who wants to reconcile prodigals. Prodigals that are sometimes wild and out there, that need to come home, and prodigals that still live in the house with a smoldering, simmering anger even towards the Father. You got people that are going to church, but they're not really with Him. They're not really in love with God. Such a sinner as that also needs to come home. And the Father stands ready and eager and able to restore you, to embrace you, to bring you home. Hope this encourages your heart as you consider the nature of your Father. I would also just want to say thank you for joining me. Thank you for being with me today. And if you're willing to stay for another time, I'll see you next time. I want to talk about that older son some more.